favourite shape is an isosceles triangle. Is that a shape?
Nice.
So desperately trying to remember things from my bad high school mathematics classes.
Unfortunately, you're on the other side of academia that does not deal with maths. You're decidedly non-STEM, so shapes and colours.
Well, exactly. And given that when I first did my classes, for maths when I was at high school, I burst into tears on my first day because it was too difficult. That really sets us up for for failure, and it's a good cold intro for today because we're talking about traumatized children. So
I was just gonna say, the education system does not really cater for people who have undiagnosed neurodivergent statuses. Although I don't know when you were diagnosed. I was as an adult.
I was diagnosed about 5 minutes ago. Yeah,
fair, and yeah, it when it happened, it explains so much. I was kind of like the glass breaking moment. But you're very welcome to Beneath the Skin, the show about the history of everything told through the history of tattooing. I'm one of your hosts, Thomas O'Mahony, and I'm joined by my esteemed co-host, co-host, author, historian, art lecturer, Dr. Matt Lauder. You know him. You subscribe to the Patreon. You know us.
Lover, friend, all of those things.
Dilettante.
Okay. Yeah. I want to start this episode with a quote. So this is from a magazine called the National Police Gazette, American magazine, from July the 30th, 1881. There was a time when tattooing was an ornamental characteristic peculiar to sailors and small boys, but like many another fashion, it's grown to more extended usefulness, or at least application. The very latest agony on Murray Hill is tattooing the baby. How do we feel about tattooing babies, Tom?
I don't really like the idea. I feel like, babies...
You're against. We'll put you down in the against column.
Yeah, they don't have object permanence. Their skull hasn't fully fused. They can't really eat solid food yet. I'm not sure I'm pro tattooing babies.
Tattooing about. So we're going to mark you in the against column for the tattooing of babies.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, essentially, this is something that I really want to talk about. The tattooing of children, because I think it's it gets us some really interesting parts from some quite deep history. So the point of this particular case in New York of tattooing a baby, as the article goes on, was essentially for identification. So one morning, however, a private carriage rolled through the filth of Cherry Street. A fashionably dressed lady, followed by a nurse with a baby in her arms, picked her way through the unclean court to Sailor Peter's door. She wanted 2 initials pricked on the baby's arms. This was the first of a number of similar customers. Some carry their little ones themselves, other subjects come in charge of nurses as aristocratic as themselves. But they come and they pay, and pay so well that Sailor Peter will be able to retire from the business altogether when the present boom subsides. So basically, it's a way of stopping your baby getting abducted, or at least that's the thought process.
Was there some sort of Oliver Twist Fagin rolling around picking up babies? I didn't know the baby industry was that the baby theft industry was that big back then. Some would say it's the podcasting of back then. One of
the reasons. So this is happening in 1881. And one of the reasons it's happening is because in 1871, about a few years earlier, there'd been this case in London called the Tichborne trial. And basically, we can probably do a whole episode on that at some point in the future. But basically, this aristocratic teenager, a guy called Roger Tichborne, went missing at sea in 1853. And his mother had sort of given up all hope that he would be found alive. Meanwhile, his younger brother inherited the family fortune and was sort of whittling it away on gambling. And then miraculously, Roger turned up alive and wanted to claim the family fortune. And to cut a long story short, it turned out that this guy, plot twist, wasn't actually the deceased aristocrat, but it was a butcher's son from Wapping called Tom Castro. So The reason this all came out in court was because the real Roger had been tattooed at boarding school, tattooed himself and his friends. And this guy in the dock didn't have any tattoos at all. And so basically there was this essentially kind of panic amongst aristocrats of like, hey, we should all tattoo our children so that if some criminal tries to steal our family fortune, move into our family pile, run off with our family titles and lands, we can prove it with the tattoo. So I think that's coming in the aftermath of that. But like, actually, it also has a really long history because there were the other place that we find something similar. Well, there are two places we find something similar in deeper history. One of which is in basically like Renaissance Italy, so 16th century Italy, in what are called foundling hospitals, right? So essentially kind of orphanages, basically, for raising of children. And mothers would leave the baby with the care of the nuns or with the care of the institution, with potentially the intention of returning. There's some really heartbreaking examples from England of like little tokens and little pieces of fabric and stuff for identification purposes. But for a while in Italy, you would basically, before you gave your baby over to the institution, you tattoo its foot with its initials and with a little symbol, so that when you came to get your baby later on, or it found you in adulthood even, you could be sure that it was actually your baby and that it hadn't died and was sneakily swapped out by the wet nurses going, no, I promise you this is your child, like with some weird Ponzi scheme. It's like
it's like premium card trading. If you don't pony up, you don't get a premium child.
Exactly that, right? So tattooing of babies is for identification. The other example of that is in the 1750s. So again, we're pre-Cook. I don't know if we mentioned this on the pre-Cook episode, but these Swabian children who essentially were like poor like peasant children of peasants, essentially in Austria, and they would get sent on this long march across the Alps to work on farms in Germany, sometimes for a whole summer season, sometimes even for several summer seasons. And then they'd return back months or many years later, to bring back the money they'd earned. And again, because these parents were worried that their children wouldn't recognize them or they wouldn't recognize them in return, they would tattoo some kind of what's called in the report about this, a mark of consanguinity. Like, this is my baby, hands off. So that's quite practical, right? Like, I think you can see the practical benefits of tattooing children. Have I changed your mind yet that tattooing children is a good thing?
So similarly to these, like the functional form of tattooing of children in I think it was the 1950s in the US, it was kind of in the Midwest. I think it was Arkansas, as far as I can remember. There was a program where several school children were tattooed. So this was obviously during the beginnings of the Cold War, or maybe it was around the Bay of Pigs, real heating up of tensions around nuclear weapons. And obviously there was a great fear in the US of nuclear weapons being used and the fallout. So you have like, you have that turtle cartoon that's about, hiding under your desk in case there's a nuclear bomb drop.
Survive, yeah.
Yeah. So essentially, these children were tattooed with their blood type in case, there was an attack, there would be a need for blood transfusions. You could identify, who needed what blood and who had what blood. And it served a functional purpose.
Yeah, that wasn't just on children, actually. That was called Operation Tat Type, and it was rolled out at the Iowa State Fair initially, and then kind of rolled around the country. Those tattoos were in people's armpits because apparently that was the part that would survive if all of your limbs got blown off. And even better, that idea came from.
Oh no! Why are we talking so much about the desecration of limbs recently? Children's exploding hands, your armpit being the only thing that would survive. Yeah, that
was last episode. Well, so the other good thing about that, the practical marking of blood types, was that it was an idea that the American government got from the Nuremberg trials. The guy who was the
Americans learning from the Nazis. Do not Google Operation Paperclip. Do not Google Operation Paperclip.
Yeah, the guy who invented this was one of the expert witnesses for the American Medical Association at the Nuremberg trials, and he saw that basically the SS, one of the way that they caught Eichmann, amongst others, was that he had the SS blood type to their officers, and he was like, "That's a good idea." And thankfully, that was the one and only thing that the Americans learned from the Nazis, Thomas.
Yes, do not look up how they got to the moon. Do not look up at the crossover between the invention of the V2 rocket with Werner von Braun and the US space program. But it's funny that they managed to find him because of a tattoo, and Otto Skorzeny had like a huge scar on his face and just like was wandering around for like 30 years and bought a farm in Ireland in the like 50s, 60s.
We've gone astray here, but Mengele actually escaped because he didn't have a tattoo, so he was pretending to be someone else. He joined the SS early. He was an OG SS member, so didn't have a blood type tattoo. And because of that, when they were doing the demobbing and looking specifically for SS members and letting rank and file soldiers go, he pretended to be someone else, and they let him go. So tattooing as identification. I mean, also talking about severed limbs. There's a great couple of cases, one of which is a severed arm, which washed up on a British beach, I think in Southend, with tattoos on it, and it was like, who does this belong to? And the other one, again, I think we mentioned on a previous episode, was a barrel full of meat, a barrel full of pork, taken by from a Dutch pirate ship, and it had a tattooed sailor's arm in it. So, tattooing for identification is probably not a bad idea.
What if they were using the arm to like, stir the pork in the barrel to make sure it didn't, stick to the side? They were just taking this like arm and like, I wonder what pickled arm tastes like. Someone get Army Hammer on the phone.
Nom. But go on. So it's also worth pointing out, that there were no laws in Britain and America that tattooing children was illegal. So tattooing of minors wasn't illegal in Britain until 1969. So there was no specific law on tattooing children before 1969. That came in because a couple of years earlier, in a case called Burrell versus Harmer, this tattooer tattooed the arm of two boys, one age 12, one age 13, and he was convicted there for basically assault, right? But there was no specific law on tattooing. And that was also the case in America, right? So a couple of other cases I want to talk about today are from the US, and particularly from New York, because, again, it may not surprise you to learn this, but the RSPCC, or the American equivalent, the New York Society for the Protection of Cruelty to Children, existed after the similar association for animals. So there was a Society for the Protection of Cruelty to Animals before there was a protection of society to cruelty to.
I mean, if all you have to do is look at media depictions in the UK, and you'll find out that a lot of people care a whole lot more about animals than about children. Before we move on to like the specific cases, and it's, since your book is coming out soon, I want to talk maybe specifically about examples in the book of, the connections between, childhood vagrancy and criminality and tattooing.
Yeah. Well, so this is exactly this case, right? These cases in New York. So New York and American society in general was much more concerned initially with the prevention of cruelty to animals than to children. But the late Victorian era, the late 19th century, brings with it this kind of increased morality policing. And one of the things that the New York Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children, also called the Children's Society, or the Jerry Society after the guy that set them up, they were interested in loads of things. They were interested in kind of, mail boys, paper boys delivering pornography. Not like, it wasn't the fact that children were working it was the problem. It was that children were getting up early in the morning to deliver newspapers and post. It was that they were delivering filthy postcards and obscene publications.
Don't worry, if they had the chance, Liz Truss would 100% repeal child labour laws.
Yeah, exactly. Why do you think?
Didn't have depression or anxiety when they were working in the mines.
Exactly. Snowflake generation. I worked down the mine and got black lung. Didn't do me any harm. So, and that also came with kind of concerns about lasciviousness and sort of immoral influence it really is a moment when kind of childhood or certainly adolescence is being kind of invented, so to speak, culturally as a context, as a concept. Part tattooing sort of becomes this really interesting, basically kind of like real distillation of both the kind of physical harm of children and the kind of moral harm of children, because tattooing, particularly in places like New York, is really associated with sailors and therefore with drinking. And it's the American military's had a good kind of PR campaign in the years since World War II, and is now a pretty upstanding institution. But during the 19th and early 20th century, the American Navy in particular was like really hotbed of kind of vice and ill behavior. And so kind of tattooing, which was associated in the popular imagination with criminality and with drinking and with sailors, was particularly harmful for children, as well as the fact it was linked with disease, it was linked with syphilis, it was linked with all kinds of horrible nastiness. So there were a few cases around the beginning of the 20th century between like, let's say, the 1870s right the way through to the kind of 1920s of children being tattooed and causing a kind of ruckus. Again, there was no specific law against it at this moment, but they were finding ways to kind of charge tattooers with new, basically kind of new statutes against kind of cruelty to children or endangering children, etc. So one of my favorite one of these is a guy called Charles Wagner, really, really important tattooer in the American tradition, working on the Bowery, really prominent and important early American tattooer. And he got in trouble twice for tattooing children. The first of which was he tattooed a Jewish boy with designs including a crucifix and the head of Christ in 1902. And there was such a craze at that time that one school in the New York Lower East Side reported several little boys and girls appearing with beetles, shrimps, lobsters, and butterflies crawling over their faces. So Wagner was like, "Well, I didn't know the kid was Jewish. sorry for tattooing a Christ head on him." And then a couple of years later, he was.
I'd say he was the only person at that time who didn't engage in a phrenology and said, "How was I supposed to know the kid was Jewish?" And then the judge was probably like, "Look at him."
Yeah, terrifyingly, right? So that was in 1902. Then a few years later, he was sentenced to 20 days imprisonment for tattooing an 11-year-old boy. This is a time when the act of kind of decorating your body, again, particularly in New York with like stickers and transfers and stuff, what get called cockamammies, is a really, really popular thing. So it is a sort of genuinely a kind of youthful fashion for a while around the turn of the century. There's a couple of amazing skin specimens in a museum in Edinburgh. I found a newspaper report from the 1890s basically saying, "Oh, I went to a lovely lecture at the museum at the University of Edinburgh yesterday, where it was presented this incredible skin of a young Irish American man." And basically, the description was, that there was this guy's tattooed skins were put on display, and that this kid had been tattooed basically so that his brother could learn tattooing. So the guy had, quote, been operated on by his brother when a boy from 4 to 7 years of age, and the process of tattooing had occupied nearly 3 years. The whole surface of the skin, except the face, hands, and soles of the feet, was covered with the most artistically executed designs. So basically, and we hear this again from Charlie Wagner and some other American tattooers as well, you didn't want to fuck up on your paying customers. So you'd have to learn to tattoo, and like your younger brother would probably be a good place to start. And I emailed the museum in Edinburgh and I said, like, okay, you definitely haven't got this skin, because I think I or my colleague Gemma Angel, who's a historian of tattooed skin preservation, who we should get on the podcast at some point, had never heard of this. But I emailed them and said, "Oh, do you know what happened to this skin?" And then, "Oh yeah, we just had a look. It's at the back of the storeroom. No one's looked at it in 120 years. Here are some pictures." So we reproduced in the book one picture of this poor guy's. He died at age 29, but this kind of full bodysuit, basically, of like Irish American designs, including a portrait of George Washington, which he'd had done presumably in the 1870s when he was about 4 or 5 years old. Yeah. And yeah, New York and London, there's a few of these. The case that I anchor some of this stuff in the book is the case of a girl called Madeline Altman. So this is a quote from the Detroit Free Press, 15th of September, 1906. When he found Madeline, Agent King noticed that he left. I feel like I should be doing like a kind of old-timey New York accent here. When he found Madeline, Agent King noticed that her left arm was much swollen and wrapped in a bandage. He asked her what the trouble was. Why, don't you know? Asked Madeline, shifting her gum from side to side. I'm having New York Pete tattoo me arms and chest. There we go. How was that?
Sound like Keir Starmer.
Old-timey American newsreel voice. So basically, this like young 15-year-old girl who was from a fairly well-to-do family. Her dad was an insurance broker in Brooklyn, but she was picked up on the Bowery, so on this kind of basically street of taverns and flop houses, cinemas, gambling houses, right? And she was covered in tattoos. So she had, for example, American flag. She had a heart inked in red. She had a flag-waving sailor. Her back was covered in a battleship. Both her arms were tattooed from elbow to wrist with daggers or other naval designs. And on her chest, not yet healed, was another warship, an eagle. She also had a self-portrait of sorts, a girl dressed in sailor togs, alongside her own initials, M.A. She also had a pocket full of photographs and letters from amorous Navy men. And yeah, like, interestingly, it explains to the gathered newspaper pack that, quote, all the girls are getting it done, she told the New York Times reporter. It's getting so the sailors won't look at you if you ain't got some tattoos on you. There's also some interesting sort of gender play, because she also said, I wish I was a boy. If I was, I bet your boots I'd be enlisted in the Navy. But the sailors are all right, they are. I just love sailor boys.
And, this is a point that I kind of want to maybe touch on, because when you look at the timeline of history, teenagehood, adolescence wasn't really a thing until the 20th century as we transition into, the post-war period. Youth, as we know it now, didn't exist. But an interesting point that's coming about in this conversation is that something that is still quite prevalent now is the fear around the transgression of class. Like, certain people don't get tattoos, and of gender, and this kind of idea that you will lose your certain place in the social pecking order if you get marks on your skin, which has ties in with religion, with Puritanism. But it is very interesting that as we move into like the post-war period, where the invention of the teenager, as we know it now, really comes about, that getting tattoos really becomes a solidified countercultural force, rather than it's just, sailors and kind of people who exist outside of a lot of the regular structures of society exist, if you know what I mean.
Well, what I love about the story of Madeline, and of sort of some of the other stories, I mean, even there's another story a few years earlier, basically involving the same New York society, a girl called Hannah, who was also tattooed. There are similar ones in the UK from a bit later on, but like, one of the things that really strikes me about them is they're not framed, and I don't think they are, explicit sort of fuck you stories of teenage rebellion. They're quite kind of naive and quite kind of, they're quite kind of, they're excited in their kind of childlike love of like, tattoos are cool. And they're not presented, because tattooing isn't functioning in this way yet culturally as a kind of sign of teenage rebellion. When tattooing on children is talked about, and there's also similar cases from France actually that I'm thinking about on young women, it's often presented as this kind of quite naive, like joyful love of this, of just looking like a sailor or playing dress up, or even, in some of the cases on tattoos of young girls or young women, like tattooing as a kind of beautification process. And it's not presented as this kind of fuck you teenage rebellion story. I've looked really hard for photos of Madeline or even drawings, and I haven't yet found one. There's a couple of leads I'm still tracking down. I'd love to see a picture of her, because she just seems awesome. I have to say, like, really just kind of joyful and excited to be tattooed. But after of course, her tattooing was taken to be, as you said, like indicative of this kind of class, problem. It wasn't just that she was tattooed; it was that she was tattooed in this particular place, in this particular way. And so she got sent as part. So the tattooers got fined. One of whom, Samuel O'Reilly, is again really one of the most important American tattooers ever. The first ever owner in the world of a patent of an electric tattoo machine. So this isn't something that's just happening in kind of like the lowest end of shops. Although we'll talk more about that later on. It's a real part of the culture, actually, of tattooing in the early years of its professional development, that, young teenagers are getting tattooed. But Madeline, basically, despite her protestations, gets sent to what's called the House of Mercy. And it's like a correctional institution in a place called Inglewood in New York. And it's a place where basically like young women in particular got sent for correction by nuns. Right. So we don't know exactly what happened to her there, but it was a pretty horrible place. Like her father basically said he would hope it would cure her of her sea madness, kind of beat this nonsense out of her. And had around 100 young women there, many of whom had been picked up and accused of sex working. It was a place where, again, had this kind of physical and moral hygiene conversation intertwined, which is, I think, tattooing is such a part of the conversation. One of their reports from around this period said, "We are raising the tone of conversation in place where girls assemble and work. Lectures on sex hygiene are given. Wholesome recreation is encouraged, and higher ideals of life are cultivated." But like, of course, that what that really meant was like humiliation, shaving of heads as punishment. One of the nuns said, "We find the girls do not like to lose their hair, and fear of having it cut off tends to make them obedient." These young women were gagged. They were malnourished. One runaway, again around the same time as Madeline was there, a girl called Isabel Cowan, was found sleeping rough in Central Park, and she said she'd rather live in the park than the House of Mercy. And during Madeline's incarceration, or shortly afterwards, one of the sisters there, a teacher called Josephine Hall, shot herself in the head, having been despondent of late. In 1915, I'm reading from my book here, in 1915, resident girls started a riot in protest at the poor conditions, and by 1920, it had closed down. In 1933, a New Yorker writer went to visit it and found graffiti on the walls saying, "I wish I was dead. God help me to get out of here. And I was put in this House of Mercy for nothing." So this kind of little joyful sailor girl with her cool sailor tattoos, for that crime, basically, or for that kind of transgression, she was put into this really horrible institution for at least several years, probably 3 or 4 years at least. Don't really know much what happened to her afterwards. The book goes into a bit more of her later life story, but I think we get these laws against tattooing of children, and I think they are generally coming from a good place, as you indicated towards the beginning. Because I don't know, if I'd have got tattooed with what I wanted to get tattooed with when I was 14, my body would look very different.
Yeah, like we will have a conversation towards the end around the agency of children. But kids are not really well known for discerning taste. That's all we'll say. But something that I want to talk about.
What would you have got tattooed on you when you were 14?
Oh, I really wanted a Foo Fighters logo when I was like 14. Thank God. But since you mentioned, the naivety around it, it's something that I want to talk about in terms of like I come from a media background, and so what you have towards the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century is a really, really big boom in the rise of, popular pulp novels that were both targeted at children and at adults. And most of them, focused on stories of adventure, stories of sailors, stories of the extravagant world outside of the horizon. And obviously, a lot of this literature and this media was targeted at both kids and adults together. So the way I see it, and the big shift as I see it after, post-war, is that both adults and kids were engaging with the kind of same stuff. So I think adults kind of had a little bit more of a more understanding viewpoint of a children's kind of naive attraction to stuff like this, that they understand like what is the appealing nature of, you know, tattooed sailors going on adventures and this kind of like lifestyle that people who might have been viewed differently about 40 years later. And I think what happened as you had that like segmentation of adolescence to adulthood is then you have the split between, you know, an adult's understanding of, you know, a child's maybe naive interests and like maybe naive choices. And now you have like the dictation of adult minds and viewpoints onto like a child's wants and needs.
Yeah, and I think, I think it is. And I think, one of the things that really bothers people about tattoos, obviously, is their permanence, right? And one of the things that people really love about their tattoos is their permanence. You know, that's why tattooing your children as babies for identificatory purposes works, and it's the same reason why people are worried about kids making bad decisions on their tattoos, because that kind of permanence really worries people. And you know, in some cultural contexts, and we're talking primarily here, obviously, about, as I said, about kind of Europe and America, but like in some places, including, as we heard a couple of weeks ago from Maya, in the Arctic, or in Fiji is another place where this happens. Tattooing is a marker of your adulthood. You know, it's an initiation rite. You can only become tattooed, or the act of tattooing actually marks or creates or generates your move into adulthood in some cultural traditions. So this kind of like, you know, casting off of childish ways, so to speak, in that biblical sense, is a really important cultural link with tattooing. And it's because I think this idea of permanence terrifies people, particularly, you know, you see it a lot in conversations, and this is a real tangent which we shouldn't really go down today because it will again be another topic for a future session. But this is also lots of the conversations about sexuality and gender identity. You know, it's like, well, let kids be kids. Don't let them make irreversible changes to their bodies. And I'm not here advocating for children to be tattooed. I really am not. I'm just trying to explain why I think what these anxieties reveal. You know, and I think they're legitimate anxieties, of course. So we should be horrified about children making irreversible changes to some degree. But like, yeah, I think this is as you say, as you always say in introduction, like tattooing being the history of everything. Like, I don't think we often think much about why we should or shouldn't tattoo people under the age of 18. As I said, it's a fairly recent phenomenon that many tattooers in Britain didn't tattoo underage kids anyway, and that was also true even if it wasn't explicitly illegal. That was also true in the United States. One of Sam Riley and Wagner's great rivals, Elmer Getchell, who was another kind of early pioneer of electric tattooing. Like he was basically sort of, he said that like true professionals would not stoop to tattooing children who lacked the capacity to choose a design on their bodies. So this kind of ethics in the industry was turning against the tattooing of children as early as the early part of the 20th century. But the fact we even have to ask this question, like, what is it about tattooing under 18s that is problematic, I think is interesting, revelatory. It tells us a lot about cultural attitudes to childhood, and it tells us a lot about cultural attitudes to things like bodily autonomy, to permanence, to our relationship with time. Yeah, all of these things, you know.
And that's actually, you mentioning time, that's something to get a bit philosophical for a second. I think part of the moral attitude around it is that from an adult perspective, once you reach a certain age, you understand both the permanence of something like tattooing, but also the impermanence of our bodies and our own mortality. And I feel like there is some sort of an understandable fear from a parent or an adult of, you know, making permanent choices before you understand the permanence of your being, but also the impermanence of it as well.
Right, and this is a very kind of culturally contingent and chronologically contingent conversation. I think conversations about adulthood are still happening. You know, maybe not so much about tattooing, but there are certainly conversations about One of the ones I saw was like whether in the United States, where it's legal to perform in pornography at 18, whether that's sensible, in the age of the internet, and people are making decisions that may affect their life in negative ways. Maybe we should up the age for performing sex on camera in America to 21 from 18. And I think, those conversations aren't happening around tattooing. But that said as well, like I wasn't tattooed when I was underage because I got into tattooing so early that I knew not to get a bad one, and you were only going to get a bad tattoo if you went to someone who wouldn't check your ID, right? But I know loads of people who were tattooed underage because they loved, like Madeline, I suppose, loved tattooing, and actually probably would have got a better tattoo than they got if they were able to go to someone who knew what they were doing. I mean, it's an unsquareable problem, but like, I mean, you must know too people who were tattooed at 15, 16, 17.
Yeah, loads of people. Like I know loads of people who've gotten like mostly stick and pokes from their friends, or they've bought machines online and done themselves. I know one or two tattoo artists who started tattooing on themselves when they were like 15, 16 because they knew that's what they wanted to do, and the only canvas they had available was their own legs or their arms, Well,
this was one of the reasons actually that tattooing became illegal in England and Wales in 1969 with the Tattooing of Minors Act. It was because there was a kind of brief craze over the course of kind of the mid 60s for tattooing. And many people weren't able to get tattooed in shops, so they were going to shitty shops. But loads of them were tattooing themselves, with compass needles, with blades from pencil sharpeners. There was a guy that used to drive my school bus who was a big, like, ex-army dude, like, skinhead guy. Like, well, he wasn't a skinhead. He had a shaven head. I don't think he was a skinhead. But he was a big dude, and he had on his wrist the word "wham" tattooed that he'd done himself. This is like in the
love George Michael
in the like early 90s. Yeah, because he'd done that when he was a kid, right? And the reason we have laws in the UK against tattooing of under 18s is because there was this moral panic that kids wanted to get tattooed. Right? You wouldn't need to ban it if kids weren't doing it already, I suppose, is the point there, right?
Yeah, and I think like maybe to touch on a broader point, funny enough, there's an Aboriginal man that I follow on TikTok who like talks about, he grew up in the bush and talks a lot about Aboriginal life in the bush and everything. And there was one video that I saw recently that like really kind of struck me, is that he was talking about he doesn't know what age he is because, age didn't really exist in the bush. So he said, my family who've been born in hospitals, they know what age they are, but I don't know what age I am. And he talked about how, that transition from childhood to adulthood, when he was a child, he helped his mother and his aunts and other female members of his group to, gather food and that sort of thing. And then he said, oh, you became a man when your facial hair started coming in. So when your mustache started to come in, that's when you started transitioning to hunting with, the men. And like you mentioned, there is cultural practices of like tattooing as a transitionary period between your childhood to your adulthood. And I think part of the pushback around tattooing on younger people, and not just necessarily like people under 18, also like younger people, is that our lines have been blurred so much in the past couple of decades of, where does childhood end and where does adulthood start? And I think maybe that's because we have somewhat gotten away or gotten rid of ceremony and cultural practices around the marking of certain periods in your life. And I think that's maybe what attracts kids to tattooing, is that, and it still attracts people, it attracts me to tattooing, that for kids, doing like a small tattoo with like your compass in class, you're trying to mark yourself as, either a period in your life where this is an adult thing, that I'm, grown, I'm making this decision, but also that you are marking a period in your life starting or beginning or ending, Yeah,
well, then there's also this interesting kind of point of independence there as well, right? That you can make the decision on your own, you're capable, have the capacity mentally to make the decisions as your own. I know tattooists often tell me that, they have people come in with their children or with their teenage children, with their 15-year-olds, maybe even younger, and say, oh, but I give parental permission, like we can override this social protection against tattooing of underage people if their parents say so. And I think lots of parents who do that are surprised to hear that no, actually it's a strict thing. You can't even if your mum says it's okay for you to get a tattoo, you can get one, and that is also kind of interesting and different from some of the other things we delegate to parents as opposed to adults. Lots of things in actually to do with bodies are complicated around that area. So it is interesting to me that tattooing probably really more than nearly anything else, maybe other than voting, is the one thing you really definitely can't. You can, people can drink before they're 18 and often do. People, smoking was moved to 18 from 16, but I know that kids are getting hold of cigarettes. I mean, maybe that's cigarettes is pretty
fruity
closer
vapes
to tattooing than alcohol is. Fruity vapes. But yeah, but tattooing is like one of the few things you really can't do. Certainly not in a tattoo studio until you're an adult, and so it does, like kind of almost by proxy, like serve that marker of adulthood. And as someone who has been an 18-year-old at one point in the past and who teaches 18-year-olds, some 18-year-olds, again myself included, are idiots. Many 18-year-olds are idiots. Again, I include myself in that.
If you're one of Matt's students and you're listening to this, he is calling you an idiot. Directly you specifically listening, he is calling you an idiot.
Actually, my students are lovely. Actually, they're not idiots. What I mean, they're really not. But what I mean is like, there's something about being 18 which it's just it's better than it's sort of roughly when most on average we think people are capable of making decisions about their bodies. But there's no hard and fast reason why on the evening of the the 365th day of your 17th year on the planet, you're all of a sudden more mature than you were yesterday. Of course, it doesn't work like that, but we have to have laws. Laws have to function like that. I was gonna say, I think it's surprising to people to learn that like we didn't always have laws against tattooing of children. That it wasn't exactly okay or tolerated, but it certainly wasn't explicitly against the law.
Moving past the establishment of like the legal precedent around tattooing of children, when you move into like the 70s and 80s, you start to see cases around like moral panics or that involve tattooing, not necessarily directly on children, but on people around children. And that's when you start to have, the satanic panic in the 80s, and that, involved, around the protection of children, and tattooing was linked to the moral panic, like the West Memphis 3. What's the guy's name? He's like he's all into esoteric stuff now.
This is
Damien Eccles. Damien Eccles is his name.
Yeah.
Oh, and I haven't watched it, but Eddie Munson in Stranger Things season 4 is based on Damien Eccles, and at that time, he's into metal. I feel like he has a tattoo as well. Satan. I'm gonna put the Satan drop in here somewhere, but it is that once again, as we post the kind of liberal 60s and 70s, you had the kind of moral strangulation of society as we move into the Thatcher and Reagan era, and social control starts to close its pincers around society, and tattooing is included in that.
Yeah, and a huge amount of the moral panic around tattooing and HIV and homosexuality was linked up with that satanic panic. Again, we'll do a whole episode about that, I think, in future. But yeah, so much of that was about preying on our children. Both predatory gay men, but also predatory tattooists, and there were tattoo artists who, if you wanted to get a cool skinhead face tattoo in London in the 80s, most reputable tattooers wouldn't do it, but there were guys tattooing who would be happy to do that, and some of them were potentially tattooing people who were under the age of 18. With one kind of ethical breach, the tattooing of the face of a young person, comes another one, not really caring about asking for ID, and that link of the tattooing kind of instantiating or representing physical and moral harm together that we saw in those cases from New York in 1900 or so are exactly the same thing rhetorically that's going on in the 1980s and 90s. And the reason we wanted to do this episode, and the reason I thought it was a good idea, is because this is exactly repeated in the recent like crazy like QAnon satanic panic, like the kind of incursion of the satanic panic into Britain through this amazing, kind of disgracefully amazing case in Hampstead. There's a good podcast
also
about
just
media.
Just for anyone listening, trigger warning here. We are going to talk about some, abuse and talk about it involving children. So, just be fair warned.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I'm not going to kind of go into the specifics here because don't need to for the point we want to make. But like, there's a really interesting podcast on this by Tortoise Media called Hoaxed. There was a show about it, or an episode about it on BBC Radio 4 as well. Essentially, the allegation was, or the case is essentially that these parents who'd broken up, the wife and her new husband wanted to basically sort of cast aspersions on the father in order to try and gain custody, and so cooked up this story around the same time as like Pizzagate was happening in the US, basically about a sort of satanic child abuse ring in Hampstead in northwest London. And the children were coached essentially to claim that they'd partaken in satanic orgies and they'd seen and partaken in the eating of human flesh. And there are some horrific kind of transcript details from the interviews that these children gave before recanting everything they said about what they said they saw. And part of it was that they said, part of the point here was that the members of the satanic paedophile ring, the satanic murder ring, were tattooed with satanic symbols, and that's how you could tell who was in the satanic cult, right? And it is amazing, as you said, that this is something which begins certainly as early as the 1970s, but becomes, but in the 2020s still has, it's still the kind of a necessary part of a narrative if you want to tell a convincing satanic death cult story, that the members of that satanic death cult have to have tattoos on their arms. It's kind of amazing, and like it again does tell us something about how when we're talking about the moral and physical harm of children, tattooing becomes a part of the narrative. So I've got a couple of transcripts here from the interviews with the two of the children. This was back in 2015. There's been court cases around it. People have gone to jail for making things up and making false accusations and for harassing families in the area. But for example, so there's a video in which the father says to one of the children, "Oh, so he doesn't have any other marks? No tattoos, nothing?" And the child says, "Yes, he has tattoos. He has a tattoo and pierce rings. Yes, he has a pierce ring on his willy where it wheezes." Right, so like being coached to tell these stories about tattooing and piercing as an indication of perversion, and then another one, the 20 special children have tattoos. All the teachers have tattoos. XXXXX, redacted, has tattoos all over his arms, and another redacted person also got tattoos on his arms, and they have it on their privates. They're devil and monster tattoos on their privates. And then the boys are asked to draw pictures of these tattoos, and some of these are reproduced in some of the court evidence, and they're reproduced on a blog, which we can link in the show notes. So essentially, like, these children are being coached into talking about tattoos, because at least as far as the stepfather who was coaching these children, tattooing was going to be indicative of a real kind of nice shorthand for the authorities. Of the kind of legitimacy and reality of these absurd and outrageous and disgusting claims. So yeah, this is something we see a lot. The stories of tattoos have come up falsely in the Bill Maloney case. where another person who was sort of making up fake claims about abuse and pedophiles and satanic rings. So tattooing is this real kind of feature because what do we know about people who have tattoos? Well, they're all they're all morally corrupt. So yeah, it's amazing how what begins, I suppose, in the early or late 19th, early 20th century is like don't tattoo children, for their good, becomes 100 or so years later. If children have tattoos, it must be because they're victims of satanic cults. Kind of astonishing that this still becomes part of the story.
Yeah, and once again, only complete and utter freaks are obsessed with other people's genitals.
Yeah, and other people's children's genitals as well, like absolutely horrific. And like, just to be really clear, like all of this has been investigated. None of it's true. Several people involved with making up the hoax and spreading it have been arrested and charged. Like, there have been cases in all kinds of courts to the authorities, as rightly so, did initially take these claims seriously because, if true, they are horrific, and then they're not the case. But it was interesting to me when I was listening to the Hoaxed podcast on the story, that how much tattooing was part of the visual narrative storytelling that was fed to these poor young children in order to try and make up for stories about their father.
Yeah, and I know we've talked about it before, but it is indicative of the cultural shorthand around tattooing to people who either aren't tattooed or aren't into tattooing, that tattooing means a certain thing to a lot of people.
Yeah, right. And again, I talk about this. If any of the listeners have seen my video on YouTube about tattoos in films, tattooing is often used in cinema as a narrative device of indicating deviance, or kind of subterfuge that reveals something about their true character. And again, I think to talk specifically about children here, like I think the idea that children haven't yet decided who they are as people, which is again a correct, I think, in general view of childhood. The idea that you can't tattoo your body because you haven't yet decided what it is, who it is you want to be or present yourself as, is also part of the conversation. So this is a thorny and complicated issue, but I think it's I hope by going from some stories which are slightly absurd, aristocratic women and their nannies bringing in their babies to get tattooed, through to this, we end up asking some quite interesting, complicated stories about things like identity formation, parental relationship to their children and responsibility to their children, social, all of these very complicated questions are revealable or articulatable through thinking about tattooing.
So, on that very deep and somber note, I want to thank you very much for subscribing to the Patreon. Thank you very much for supporting us. You obviously enjoy the show. You probably follow us online. If not, and if this is in a future point where it might be released publicly, you can listen to more episodes like this on Patreon. For as little as £5 a month, you get early episodes, bonus episodes, and you get to form a parasocial relationship with myself and Matt. For more episodes, you can follow us on Spotify or whatever streaming service you use. You probably already do if you're on Patreon. If not, and someone sent you this episode, check us out. You can find me online at Got.Guineys, that's Guyneys. You can find Matt at Matt Lodder, that's Mattlodde, or on almost every platform. And don't forget to buy his book, Painted People, out on the 27th of October. If you subscribe at the £15 tier, you will get a signed copy sent directly to you.
100%. And many of the stories we've touched upon today and their contexts are expanded through longer stories with footnotes and references, so you can go and look up all the primary sources for yourself in the book. Particularly the story of Madeline is a whole chapter which we've drawn on today, but there are wider stories on the satanic panic and tattooing in the 1980s, on tattooing of children for identification, a whole chapter on the Tichborne trial. So all of these themes run through the book, and I hope people will enjoy it. And yeah, if you subscribe at the £15 level, you will get a free copy of the book signed by me.
Yeah. Anyway, thank you very much for listening, and we'll talk to you in the next episode. Bye.